Cold wind pushed through the narrow downtown alley behind the old Riverside bus terminal as a crowd gathered around the commotion. Phones were already up. Someone was recording. At the center of it stood a large black and tan German shepherd sitting perfectly still beside a fallen man. The dog's posture was disciplined, unmoving despite the shouting around him. Two security guards were approaching carefully, hands half raised. "Control your dog," one of them barked toward the small group standing nearby. But the dog did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched. Ears forward, eyes locked. The man on the ground beside him was unconscious, half buried in drifting snow that had blown in from the street. A police siren could be heard somewhere in the distance. But then the dog suddenly stood up. He stepped away from the man, turned, and began walking down the alley. Then he stopped, looked back at the crowd, and barked once. Short, urgent, as if he was telling them to follow. Everyone thought the dog had been lost. But the truth was far worse. Because the place he was about to lead them might reveal what happened to his master. If you were there, would you trust the dog and follow him into the storm? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe to Brave Canine Stories to see what happens next. Establish the winter setting, introduce the disciplined German shepherd, and reveal the first clue that something serious has happened to the dog's master. Early evening winds swept through the small mountain town of Millbrook, Colorado, pushing thin streams of snow down the narrow alley behind Riverside bus terminal. The sky had turned a heavy gray as the winter storm rolled in earlier than expected, and most people had already hurried indoors. Behind the alley, a small brick cafe called Hart's Corner sat quietly, its warm yellow lights glowing through the frosted windows. Olivia Hart stepped outside through the back door carrying a trash bag. She had owned the cafe for 8 years and was used to the cold Colorado winters, but tonight the wind had a sharper bite to it. Snowflakes had begun swirling harder, spinning through the alley like drifting ash. She walked toward the metal dumpster and lifted the lid. That was when she saw him. At first she thought it was just a large dog sitting near the alley wall. But then she noticed the man. A tall figure lay half on his side in the snow about 15 feet away. His coat and shoulders were dusted with snow that had already begun piling up, and beside him sat a German shepherd. The dog was large, powerful, black and tan with a thick winter coat. He was sitting perfectly upright next to the man's body, posture straight and alert. Not pacing, not whining, just sitting, watching. Olivia froze. The dog's head slowly turned toward her. Ears forward, eyes sharp. But the dog didn't move. There was no growling, no barking. Just quiet attention. Olivia spoke softly, raising one hand slightly so the dog could see it. "Hey there, easy boy." The dog continued watching her. Only when she took a careful step closer did she see the man's face clearly. His skin looked pale against the snow. His breathing was shallow, barely visible in the cold air. Olivia's stomach tightened. "Oh no," she crouched slowly, careful not to startle the dog. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt him." The German shepherd shifted slightly but remained seated beside the man's shoulder. That was when Olivia noticed the collar. It wasn't a normal pet collar. It was thick, black tactical nylon with a metal plate attached to the front. Snow had gathered across the letters, but Olivia brushed some of it away gently. The plate read, "Coda, Service K9. Olivia blinked in surprise. Service K9. This wasn't someone's house pet. This was a working dog. She looked back at the man lying in the snow. Okay, we're getting help." Olivia pulled her phone from her coat pocket and dialed emergency services. As she spoke to the dispatcher, the wind picked up again, sending snow spinning down the alley. Within a few minutes, lights began turning on in nearby shops. 2 employees from the bus terminal stepped outside. A mechanic from the repair garage across the street wandered over. Soon 6 people stood at the mouth of the alley, whispering and watching the strange scene. The German shepherd remained exactly where he had been from the start. Still, disciplined. Guarding the man. One of the bystanders spoke quietly. "Is that guy dead?" Olivia shook her head. "He's breathing." "Barely." Another man squinted at the dog. "That dog yours?" "No," Olivia said. But look at him. The group watched. Even through the growing snow, the dog looked calm and controlled. Not panicked, not confused. He looked like he was working, like he had a job. And then Olivia noticed something else. The dog's eyes. Every few seconds, Coda glanced down the alley toward the street beyond, then back to the man. Then toward the alley again and again. Almost like he was checking something, waiting. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "What are you looking for, boy?" She spoke gently and tried a simple command. "Sit." The dog didn't move, because he was already sitting. Perfect posture, exactly the way a trained working dog would sit during duty. Olivia felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. This dog wasn't confused. He wasn't wandering, he was waiting. Waiting for something, or someone. And then suddenly, the dog stood. The movement startled several people in the crowd. Coda walked about 10 steps down the alley toward the open street. Snow whipped around him as the storm grew stronger. Then he stopped, turned his head, looked directly back at the group behind him, and barked once. A single sharp sound that echoed against the brick walls. It didn't sound like aggression. It sounded like a signal. Increased tension through public pressure and skepticism, while planting the first solid clue about the dog and his master. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the alley as 2 security guards from the Riverside bus terminal pushed through the growing crowd. Both men wore thick navy jackets with reflective stripes and carried handheld radios clipped to their shoulders. The older guard, a tall man named Rick Dalton, immediately stopped when he saw the German shepherd standing beside the unconscious man. "Whoa," Rick said sharply, raising a hand. Nobody move. His partner, younger and clearly nervous around dogs, stepped slightly behind him. "That thing looks like it's guarding him." Several people stepped back automatically. Phones remained raised. Recording. Rick studied the dog carefully. Coda had stood up again when the crowd grew closer. He positioned himself beside the fallen man's shoulder, body angled protectively toward anyone approaching. The dog's posture was calm but firm. "Watchful," Rick pointed. "Who owns the dog?" No one answered. Olivia stepped forward slightly. "I think he belongs to the man on the ground." Rick frowned. "Well, somebody better control him before he hurts someone." The younger guard reached toward his radio. "I can call animal control." The moment he took a step closer, Coda's ears snapped forward. A low rumble came from the dog's chest. Not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable. A controlled warning. The younger guard froze mid-step. "Did you hear that?" Rick narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, that's a protection stance." Olivia shook her head quickly. "He's not being aggressive. He's protecting the man." Rick gave a dismissive chuckle. "Lady, that's what stray dogs do when they get territorial." "He's not a stray," Olivia said firmly. Rick shrugged. "Looks like one to me." Behind them, the crowd had grown larger. People from the bus terminal lobby had wandered outside after hearing the sirens in the distance. Someone whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Maybe the guy's homeless." Another voice replied, "Yeah. Probably passed out back here." A teenager holding his phone laughed. "Dog probably just followed him." Olivia ignored them and knelt carefully beside the man again. She brushed snow away from his coat. The German shepherd watched her closely but did not interfere. "Easy, boy," she murmured. The dog's gaze shifted briefly toward the alley entrance again. Then back to her. That strange pattern again. Watching the street, watching the man, watching everyone. Olivia reached toward the man's coat pocket. "I'm just checking his ID." Coda did not react. Slowly, she pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside were several cards. She slid out the first one. An identification card. The name printed clearly across the front read, "Daniel Mercer." Below the name were smaller words, "Search and Rescue Volunteer." Olivia blinked. She looked up toward the guards. "He's not homeless." Rick stepped closer to see the card. "Search and rescue?" At that moment, something slipped from the wallet and fell into the snow. A photograph. Olivia picked it up. The image was slightly faded but clear enough. A man in outdoor rescue gear stood on a mountain ridge beside a powerful German shepherd, wearing a bright orange search harness. The same dog. The same eyes. The same alert ears. Olivia turned the photo so everyone could see. This is him. The crowd grew quieter. Phones lowered slightly. The dog, sitting beside the unconscious man, was not a stray. He was a trained search dog. Rick scratched his chin uneasily. Well, that changes things. Another bystander spoke softly. So the dog's working? Olivia nodded. I think so. As if responding to the moment, Coda suddenly moved again. The German shepherd stepped away from Daniel Mercer and walked slowly down the alley toward the street. Snow whipped past him in the growing wind. He stopped about 15 feet away, then turned. Looked directly back at the group. His eyes settled on Olivia. And he barked once. Loud. Clear. This time there was no mistaking it. It sounded like a command, or an instruction. Rick crossed his arms. What the hell is that dog doing? But Olivia was staring at the alley ahead. Then she whispered quietly, almost to herself, I think he wants us to follow. Authorities take control of the scene while skepticism grows, but the dog introduces a critical piece of evidence that changes everything. The distant police siren that had been echoing through the snowy streets finally grew louder. Within moments, flashing red and blue lights reflected across the brick walls of the alley. A patrol car stopped at the alley entrance, tires crunching over fresh snow. Officer Grant Collins stepped out. He was a tall officer in his late 30s, wearing a thick winter patrol jacket and dark knit cap pulled low against the wind. His breath fogged in the cold air as he approached the gathered crowd. All right, everyone step back, Collins said calmly. Give us some room. The crowd shifted reluctantly, several people still holding their phones up to record. Behind him, an ambulance pulled to the curb. 2 paramedics hurried down the alley carrying medical equipment. Collins's eyes moved immediately to the center of the scene, the unconscious man in the snow, and the German shepherd standing beside him. The dog was alert but steady, body positioned between the man and the crowd. Rick, the security guard, pointed toward the dog. Officer, that animal's guarding him. Might want to restrain it. The younger guard added quickly, Yeah, we were about to call animal control. Collins studied the dog for a moment. The shepherd's posture wasn't wild or unpredictable. It was controlled, professional. Collins had seen that posture before during canine training demonstrations. He stepped forward slowly. Easy there, boy. The dog's ears twitched, but he did not move. Collins lowered his voice slightly. Sit. The reaction was immediate. The German shepherd sat down without hesitation. Perfect posture, straight back. Focused eyes. The entire crowd noticed. Rick muttered quietly, Well, I'll be. Collins crouched slightly, studying the dog. That's not a stray. Olivia stepped forward. I told them. Collins glanced up at her. You saw what happened? She nodded. He was already here when I came outside. The dog's been guarding him the whole time. Collins looked toward the paramedics who were now kneeling beside Daniel Mercer. One of them checked the man's pulse. Pulse is weak, the paramedic called out. Looks like hypothermia. The second paramedic began setting up a thermal blanket. Collins returned his attention to Olivia. And you said the dog was trying to lead people somewhere? Yes, Olivia said quickly. He keeps walking down the alley and barking for us to follow. Rick scoffed. Or it's just wandering around. Collins didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained on the dog. Coda. The name was still visible on the tactical collar. The dog looked past Collins for a moment, staring toward the alley entrance where snow continued blowing across the street. Then his nose dropped toward the ground. He began sniffing. Slowly. Methodically. The shepherd walked a few feet toward a patch of snow near the alley wall. He pawed lightly at the surface. Collins watched carefully. What is it, boy? Coda lowered his head again and grabbed something from the snow. Then he walked straight toward Collins. The dog stopped directly in front of the officer and gently dropped the object at his boots. Collins looked down. It was small, bright against the white snow. A child's shoe. Red fabric with a small white stripe across the side. The alley went completely quiet. Collins picked up the shoe slowly. It was damp with melted snow, but the bottom of the sole was clean, almost spotless, which meant something important. The shoe hadn't been lying outside very long. Rick leaned forward slightly. Where did that come from? Olivia looked around the alley. There's no kid here. One of the teenagers in the crowd lowered his phone. Wait, if that's a kid's shoe, another bystander finished the thought in a quiet whisper. Where's the kid? The wind pushed harder down the alley, swirling snow around their boots. Collins stared at the small red shoe in his hand. Then he looked at Coda. The German Shepherd had already turned away. The dog began walking again toward the open street beyond the alley. His pace steady, purposeful. After a few steps he stopped, looked back at the officer, and waited, as if he expected them to follow. Pressure from authority figures and public safety concerns begins pushing against the idea of trusting the dog, while the worsening storm raises the urgency of a possible missing child. Snow was now falling harder. The wind that had been drifting through the alley earlier had turned sharper, pushing sheets of white through the narrow corridor between the buildings. Street lights at the far end flickered as snow gathered around them. Officer Grant Collins stood in the middle of the alley holding the small red shoe. The weight of it felt heavier than it should. Behind him, the paramedics worked quickly beside Daniel Mercer, wrapping the unconscious man in a thermal blanket. One paramedic spoke urgently. "Officer, we need to move him soon. His core temperature is dropping." Collins nodded but didn't move yet. His attention kept shifting between the red shoe in his hand and the German Shepherd waiting near the alley entrance. Coda stood still for a moment. Then he began pacing. Not wildly, not panicked, just a slow, controlled movement back and forth across the snow. His ears remained forward, eyes focused on Collins, as if waiting for something, or someone. Rick, the terminal security guard, shook his head. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. Just then, another voice came from behind the crowd. "All right, what's going on here?" A heavy-set man in a thick black security coat pushed through the people gathered at the alley entrance. His badge read, "Security Supervisor, Mark Delaney." He looked immediately irritated. Rick stepped toward him. "Supervisor, guy collapsed back here. Dog's guarding him." Delaney glanced briefly at the paramedics. Then his eyes locked onto the German Shepherd. "Whose dog is that?" "Belongs to the guy on the ground," Rick answered. Delaney frowned. "Well, that's a problem." He turned toward Officer Collins. "Officer, we need this alley cleared. This is private terminal property." Collins lifted an eyebrow. "We're handling it." Delaney gestured at the growing crowd. "Phones out, people recording, a loose dog walking around. This is a liability issue." He pointed toward Coda. "That animal needs to be restrained or removed." Olivia stepped forward before Collins could respond. "He's not loose." Delaney looked at her. "He's trained. He brought that shoe." She pointed at Collins's hand. Delaney glanced at it briefly. "A shoe doesn't mean anything." Olivia's voice sharpened. "It means there might be a missing child." The crowd murmured again. Delaney shook his head dismissively. "Or it means a kid dropped a shoe somewhere earlier today." Officer Collins remained silent. He was watching the dog. Coda had stopped pacing now. The shepherd stood facing the alley entrance where the snow-covered street waited beyond. Then the dog barked once. Short, sharp. Everyone turned. Coda immediately sat again. Perfect posture. Eyes locked on Collins. Waiting. Collins exhaled slowly. Rick crossed his arms. "You can't seriously be thinking of chasing after a dog." Collins didn't answer. Instead, he turned back toward the paramedics. One of them had pulled off Daniel Mercer's gloves while checking circulation in his hands. The paramedic frowned. "Officer." Collins stepped closer. "What is it?" The paramedic lifted Daniel's hands slightly. Both palms were scraped raw. Snow and ice clung to the skin. There were thin streaks of frozen dirt beneath the nails. Collins studied the injuries carefully. "These look fresh." "Yeah," the paramedic said quietly. Like he was digging in the snow. Collins looked down the alley again. Digging. Searching. For something. Or someone. Behind him the wind howled louder between the buildings. Snowflakes now fell thick enough to blur the end of the street. Visibility was dropping fast. Olivia spoke softly beside him. "If there's a kid out there," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Everyone understood. A child lost outside in this storm would not survive long. Collins looked at the red shoe again. Then at the dog. Coda was still sitting. Waiting. Patient. Disciplined. The kind of patience only a trained working dog would have. Collins stepped toward him. The dog immediately stood. Ready. Collins took a slow breath and made his decision. He looked back toward the alley and spoke quietly but firmly. "Let's see where the dog goes. Reveal a critical discovery that raises the stakes from a possible accident to a potential abduction." Officer Grant Collins stepped out of the alley and onto the snow-covered street, the red shoe still in his gloved hand. The German Shepherd moved immediately. Coda didn't run wildly. He moved with steady, purposeful strides down the sidewalk, nose occasionally lowering to the snow, then lifting again to scan the path ahead. Collins followed close behind. Olivia and two bystanders who had volunteered to help came with him. Behind them, the flashing ambulance lights slowly faded as the paramedics prepared to transport Daniel Mercer. The storm had grown stronger. Snow now fell thick and fast, covering sidewalks and parked cars in a growing blanket of white. The dog crossed the first intersection without hesitation. His pace remained controlled, almost mechanical in its focus. Collins noticed something important. Coda wasn't wandering. He was tracking. The dog would lower his nose briefly, confirm something in the snow, then continue forward with renewed confidence. "Stay close," Collins told the small group behind him. They passed one block, then another. Streetlights cast long, hazy cones through the blowing snow. Visibility was shrinking by the minute. Finally, the dogs slowed. Ahead of them stood a small neighborhood park. A chain-link fence surrounded a snow-covered playground with swings, benches, and a bright red plastic slide. Coda trotted through the open gate, then stopped near the base of the slide. The shepherd immediately began pawing at the snow. Not aggressively, but quickly. Purposefully, Collins stepped forward. "What did you find, boy?" The dog kept digging. Olivia knelt beside him and brushed snow aside with her gloved hands. Within seconds, something appeared beneath the surface. Small impressions in the snow. Footprints, tiny, child-sized. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God!" Collins crouched down. The prints were partially filled with fresh snow but still visible. A child had definitely been here, and recently. He followed the line of footprints across the playground. They moved from the slide toward the back fence of the park. Collins stood and shined his flashlight toward the far side. The beam cut through the snowstorm. The tracks continued, but then Collins noticed something else. A second set of footprints, larger, adult size, following the smaller ones. Olivia saw it too. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "That's not good." Collins studied the ground carefully. The larger tracks had deeper impressions in the snow. Heavier weight, longer stride. And they stayed directly behind the child's path, not beside it. Following. The realization settled over the group slowly. This wasn't a child who had wandered off. Someone had been chasing them. Or worse, taking them. Olivia shook her head quietly. "This isn't a missing kid." Collins finished the thought. "This is an abduction." Behind them, the sound of boots crunching through snow approached quickly. Security Supervisor Mark Delaney had followed the group with two terminal employees. He looked around the playground impatiently. "What did you find?" Collins pointed his flashlight at the tracks. Child footprints. Then he moved the beam slightly. "And those." Delaney squinted. "Adult tracks." He shook his head. "Well, then we definitely need to stop here." Collins frowned. "What?" Delaney crossed his arms. "This just became a criminal investigation. You need detectives here before anyone contaminates the scene." Olivia looked at him in disbelief. "But the storm is covering everything." Delaney shrugged. "That's procedure." Officer Collins hesitated. He knew Delaney wasn't completely wrong. But he also knew something else. Time mattered. Especially in weather like this. While the adults argued, Coda had continued moving. The dog followed the trail toward the back fence of the park. He slipped through a narrow opening where the fence had bent outward. On the other side lay a narrow drainage path that ran between two rows of trees. Snow already covered much of the ground there. Coda lowered his nose again and followed the fading trail. Collins shined his flashlight forward. The child's tracks continued for several more yards. Then suddenly, they stopped. Not because the child had turned, not because the trail ended, but because the deeper snow had already buried them. The footprints disappeared into the storm. The search reaches a near breaking point as the storm erases the trail, but the dog refuses to stop and uncovers another critical clue. The drainage path behind the park ran like a narrow white corridor between rows of leafless trees. Wind howled through the branches above, shaking loose snow that drifted down in thick waves. Visibility had dropped sharply. Streetlights from the nearby road barely reached this far, leaving the searchers relying mostly on flashlights. Officer Grant Collins moved carefully along the edge of the drainage ditch, sweeping his beam across the snow-covered ground. Coda worked several yards ahead of him. The German Shepherd moved low and focused, nose close to the snow, as he followed whatever faint scent remained. Behind Collins, Olivia Hart and two volunteers spread out carefully, scanning the ground. The snowstorm was now fully building. Each minute that passed made the tracks harder to see. Collins followed the line where the footprints had last been visible. But within a few yards they disappeared completely beneath fresh snow. He knelt down and brushed at the surface with his glove. Nothing. The trail was gone. Olivia stepped closer, breathing heavily in the cold air. "Can you still see anything?" Collins shook his head slowly. "The storm's burying it." The volunteers scanned the ground with their flashlights but found nothing. For a moment, the entire search line stopped moving. The only sound was the wind pushing snow through the drainage channel. One of the volunteers spoke quietly. "If the kid came through here, we're losing the trail." Another voice answered from farther back. "We might need more people." Collins stood and looked into the swirling darkness ahead. The reality of the situation was settling in. Without tracks, finding a missing child in a storm like this could take hours. Hours the child might not have. Olivia rubbed her hands together for warmth. "What if we're already too late?" Collins didn't answer. He was watching the dog. Coda had slowed down but had not stopped. The shepherd continued moving back and forth across the snow, nose working constantly. Then suddenly the dog paused, his head lifted. He turned sharply to the right. For a brief moment he stood completely still. Then he moved, not cautiously this time. The dog broke into a run along the drainage path. "Coda!" Collins called out. The shepherd raced ahead through the falling snow. Collins followed quickly. "Stay with me," he shouted back to the others. The group hurried after the dog. About 50 yards farther down the drainage path, a small structure appeared through the storm. An old maintenance shed. The building was wooden and weathered, with peeling paint and a rusted metal roof half buried in snowdrifts. It sat alone near the edge of the drainage channel, probably used years earlier for park equipment. Coda slowed as he reached the shed. His nose dropped to the ground again. He circled the front entrance. Then he stopped. Collins reached the building seconds later and swept his flashlight across the snow near the door. Something bright reflected in the beam. He stepped closer. There, half buried in the snow just outside the shed door, lay another small object. Red fabric. Collins bent down and picked it up. Another shoe, the same size. The same color, matching the one Coda had brought earlier. Olivia arrived behind him and covered her mouth with her hand. "That's the other one." The realization hit instantly. The child had been here. Very recently. Before Collins could say anything, Coda stepped directly in front of the shed door. The German Shepherd stiffened. His ears locked forward. And then he began barking. Sharp, repeated. Directed straight at the locked door. Coda's barking echoed against the wooden walls of the maintenance shed, sharp and urgent in the middle of the storm. Officer Grant Collins stepped closer to the door, snow whipping past his shoulders. "Everyone stay back," he ordered. The German Shepherd stepped aside slightly but remained directly beside the entrance. muscles tense, eyes fixed on the door. Collins grabbed the metal handle. It didn't move. Locked. Olivia stood several feet behind him, clutching her coat tighter around her shoulders. "That kid was here," she said quietly. Collins looked down at the red shoe in his hand again, then at the matching one lying in the snow beside the door. He didn't hesitate anymore. Collins stepped back half a step and drove his shoulder into the door. The old wood creaked loudly, but held. He tried again. The second impact cracked the weak latch. On the third hit, the door burst open with a sharp snap. Wind rushed into the small structure as snow blew across the floor. Collins immediately raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the inside of the shed. The space was small, rough wooden walls, a concrete floor, a broken shelf against the back wall. But several objects on the ground made his stomach tighten. A blanket, thin and worn, half crumpled near the center of the room. Beside it sat a small backpack, bright blue, the kind a young child might carry to school. Olivia stepped into the doorway behind him and gasped. "That's a kid's bag." Collins moved slowly into the shed, scanning every corner. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. The room was empty. But something about the scene felt wrong. The blanket had been moved recently. Snow had blown across the floor, but several areas were still clear, as if someone had been sitting there not long ago. Collins crouched beside the backpack. Inside were a small water bottle, a child's jacket, and a folded coloring book. Olivia's voice shook slightly. "They were here," Collins nodded slowly. "Very recently. But the child wasn't." He stepped back outside, scanning the tree line surrounding the shed. The storm had intensified even more. Wind pushed snow sideways through the trees, making the world feel smaller and quieter. Coda suddenly moved. The German Shepherd lowered his nose to the ground again and circled the shed once. Then he began following a scent trail toward the tree line. Collins followed a few steps behind. "What do you have, boy?" The dog moved about 10 yards from the shed. Then he stopped. Completely still. His posture changed instantly. Every muscle tightened. His ears locked forward, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Collins felt the shift immediately. Coda wasn't warning randomly. He had detected someone nearby. Collins slowly reached for the radio clipped to his jacket. "Dispatch. Possible suspect in the area," he began quietly. Before he could finish the transmission, another sound cut through the storm. Crunch. Snow compressing under weight. Footsteps. They came from behind the shed, slow, cautious. Someone was walking toward them through the snow. And they were getting closer. The crunch of footsteps grew louder behind the maintenance shed. Officer Grant Collins raised his flashlight toward the tree line, the beam cutting through the heavy snowfall. "Police," he called out sharply. "Step into the light." For a moment there was only the sound of wind moving through the trees. Then a figure appeared. A tall man wearing a dark winter jacket stepped cautiously out from behind the shed. His eyes darted quickly between Collins, Olivia, and the German Shepherd standing several yards away. The man froze when he noticed the dog. Collins kept his voice steady. "Hands where I can see them." The man hesitated, then suddenly turned. He bolted toward the tree line. "Stop!" Collins shouted. The suspect didn't stop. He plunged into the trees, kicking up snow as he ran. Collins reacted instantly. "Coda, track." The command cut cleanly through the storm. The German Shepherd launched forward. Coda moved like a trained missile, accelerating across the snow with powerful strides. His body stayed low as he followed the fleeing man's scent trail. The suspect crashed through branches ahead, trying to gain distance. But deep snow slowed him down. Coda closed the gap quickly. Within seconds, the dog was nearly on him. The suspect glanced back and panicked. He tried to change direction sharply. That was the moment Coda struck. The German Shepherd leaped forward and grabbed the man's sleeve with a controlled bite, pulling him off balance. The suspect fell hard into the snow. Coda maintained the hold exactly as trained, keeping pressure on the arm without moving higher or escalating the attack. "Don't move!" Collins shouted as he sprinted forward. The suspect struggled once. Coda growled, tightening the hold slightly. The man immediately froze. "All right." "All right," the suspect yelled. "Get the dog off me." Collins reached them seconds later. He pulled the man's arms behind his back and secured the handcuffs quickly. "Coda, release." The dog obeyed instantly. Coda stepped back and sat beside Collins, watching the suspect closely but no longer touching him. Collins caught his breath as he checked the cuffs. "Dispatch, suspect in custody." Olivia arrived moments later, panting from the run. "Did you get him?" Collins nodded. "Yeah." But then Olivia pointed toward the trees. "Wait." Coda had already turned his head. The dog stood and moved several yards deeper into the wooded edge beside the drainage path. He sniffed the snow quickly, then began pawing at something. Collins followed immediately. "What is it?" The flashlight beam swept across the ground. A small shape lay partially hidden behind a fallen log, curled tightly beneath a thin blanket. A child. The boy looked no older than 6 or 7. Snow had gathered around him, but the blanket and tree branches had shielded him from the worst of the wind. Olivia dropped to her knees beside him. "Oh my God!" She gently brushed snow from the child's coat. "Hey, sweetheart, can you hear me?" The boy stirred weakly, his eyes opened slightly. Cold, but alive. Collins immediately radioed for the ambulance. "Found the child." "Repeat, child located alive." Olivia wrapped the blanket tighter around the boy. "You're safe now," she whispered. Within minutes, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles appeared through the trees as officers and paramedics rushed toward them. The suspect sat cuffed in the snow nearby, watched closely by Collins. But the focus had shifted. Everyone's attention was now on the small child being carefully lifted onto a stretcher. As the paramedics worked, Collins spoke quietly with Olivia. "That dog didn't just track the suspect." Olivia nodded. "He found the shoes, and he led us here." Just then, one of the paramedics spoke up. "You said the dog belongs to the man in the alley?" "Yes," Olivia said. "Daniel Mercer." The paramedic nodded slowly. "Your friend might have saved this kid." Collins looked at Coda. The German shepherd sat calmly near the ambulance lights, snow dusting his thick fur. Patient. Focused. Waiting. Olivia remembered the photograph from the wallet. Daniel Mercer standing beside the dog wearing a search harness. Search and rescue. It finally made sense. Daniel had likely discovered the abduction while walking through the area. He must have tried to follow the suspect and protect the child. But the storm and exhaustion had overwhelmed him. Before collapsing, he had sent Coda. The dog had done exactly what he had been trained to do: find help and lead rescuers back. The paramedics lifted the child into the ambulance. As the doors closed, the crowd that had followed the search stood silently nearby. No one was filming anymore. Officer Collins walked back toward Coda and knelt slightly. "Good work, partner." The German shepherd wagged his tail once, then calmly walked toward the ambulance and sat beside it, waiting for his master. Snow still covered the streets of Millbrook, but the wind had calmed and the sky had softened from dark gray to a pale winter blue. Inside Millbrook General Hospital, the emergency department had grown quiet again after the long night. Daniel Mercer lay in a hospital bed under several warm blankets. Monitors beside him beeped steadily, showing a slow but stable heartbeat. His face still looked pale from the cold exposure, but the worst of the hypothermia had passed. A nurse checked his temperature and gave a small approving nod. "You're lucky," she said gently. "Another hour out there, and it could have been much worse." Daniel nodded weakly. His throat was dry and his body still felt heavy, but one thought kept repeating in his mind. "Coda," he said quietly. The nurse smiled. "You mean your dog?" Daniel looked toward the doorway. "Is he here?" Before the nurse could answer, another voice came from the hallway. "He never left." Officer Grant Collins stepped into the room. Beside him walked the familiar black and tan shape. Coda. The German shepherd moved calmly into the hospital room and immediately approached the bed. Daniel lifted his hand slightly. "Coda, here!" The dog rested his head gently against Daniel's arm. His tail wagged once, slowly, not excited. Just relieved. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and breathed out. "You did good, partner." Officer Collins leaned against the wall nearby. He did more than good. Daniel looked up. The kid? Collins nodded. Safe. He folded his arms and continued. Paramedics said he had mild hypothermia, but he's going to be fine. Daniel let out a long breath he had been holding since the moment he collapsed. What about the guy, already in custody? Collins replied. Witnesses, footprints, and those shoes your dog found. All of it ties him to the abduction. Daniel glanced down at Coda again. I didn't think I'd make it back to town. Collins raised an eyebrow. So you sent the dog? Daniel nodded. That's what we train for in search and rescue. If I go down, he finds help. Collins shook his head slightly in amazement. Well, it worked. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived at the hospital. A small boy walked into the room holding his mother's hand. The child was wrapped in a thick winter coat and hospital blanket. He looked nervous at first, until he saw the dog. His eyes widened. That's the dog. The boy stepped closer and knelt carefully in front of Coda. Thank you, he said softly. Coda simply wagged his tail again. The boy's mother wiped tears from her eyes as she thanked Daniel. You saved my son. Daniel shook his head gently. No. He looked down at the dog beside the bed. He did. That evening, as the sun set over the snowy town of Millbrook, Coda rested quietly beside Daniel's hospital bed. The room was calm, peaceful. Officer Collins paused at the doorway before leaving. He looked once more at the German shepherd lying beside his handler. Then he said quietly, That dog didn't wander into town. He nodded toward Coda. He came for help. Daniel smiled faintly. And in the quiet of the hospital room, one simple truth remained. Sometimes the bravest rescuer isn't the one speaking. It's the one who knows exactly when to lead. The bravest rescuer tonight had 4 legs and never said a word.